So without much further ado, let me call on Maureen Lumley to introduce our speaker tonight as if he needs an introduction.
Right. Thank you, Charles. And as always, it's my just distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. James Hollis, who I'm sure you all know does not need very much introduction. So I'm not going to go into the long, many accomplishments of Dr. Hollis here, but just to reiterate that he is the author of, I think, more than 16 books now. Is that right, James?
Yes.
And a lot of them, they've been translated into more than 20 languages, I believe. So his knowledge and wisdom has been spread all around the world. And I know that we all appreciate so much Dr. Hollis's ability to articulate his thoughts in a language that we can all understand. And the central theme of many of Dr. Hollis's books are, of course, the evolution of consciousness and the individuation process. And on this topic, I quote him as saying, "We are not here to fit in, be well balanced, or provide examples for others. We're here to be eccentric, different, perhaps strange, perhaps merely to add our small piece, our little clunky, chunky selves, to the great mosaic of being. As the gods intended, we are here to become more and more ourselves." So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. James Hollis, who is going to be presenting tonight on archetypal presences, the forms rolling beneath the surface of our lives. So welcome to this meeting, Dr. Hollis, and we're looking forward to hearing your wisdom.
Thank you, Maureen, and thanks to each of you this evening for joining us. It feels strange to be in Dallas and not in Dallas. I've been in Dallas for the last 20 plus years in February, because I think many of you know my daughter lives just north of Dallas, and it's a great visit. But in fact, my last road trip was Dallas a year ago, I think this weekend or last weekend. So it sort of helps date when the Iron Curtain of the plague came down upon us. So at least we have this way of communicating. Well, I'm grateful for that. If we're not on Mockingbird Road, we can at least be comfortable in our own homes. So Maureen mentioned that, or maybe she didn't mention actually, but I will mention that tonight's presentation is really the first essay in a book that just came out last week. It's, I don't know why you can't see it. There it is. It's called Prisms, and it's a collection of 11 essays on various subjects, and I'm going to speak tonight on the first essay that's in that book. And if anybody's interested, by the way, I'll be teaching a course online through the Washington Jung Society starting this coming Tuesday night. If you're interested, we'll be talking about comedy, why we laugh, problem of evil, the maturation process. It's illustrated through the life and work of Yeats, the poet, and the last one's on the aging process. So this particular essay got triggered last summer. A friend of mine who was at the New Jersey shore dreamt that she was out in a raft in the ocean and just sort of floating there and looking up at the sky, and a large beluga whale came up underneath her raft and lifted her raft off the ground, or off the water rather, and they went coursing across the water. And at first she was terrified. And then she realized what a wonderful gift this is. She knew she was in the presence of the mystery. And then the whale went under again, and her raft was there, and she was perfectly fine. And she felt that it had been a kind of visitation, an aperture into some kind of supportive structure that came from beneath, from the great unconscious, so to speak, that rose to support her. So I was reflecting on that theme when she wrote this to me in an email. I asked her if I could use her experience. And I also remember an Ojibwe, American Indian Ojibwe sort of poem years ago that I quoted in one of the books that said, I go about worrying about all my little problems, and all the while I'm carried by great winds across the sky. So that was a starting point for reflecting on what lies beneath the surface of our lives, what energies are carrying us through, what I'll call archetypal presences. So I'd like to share this first essay with you. And I'm going to begin with 4 lines from a poem by Ezra Pound, in which he said, "The light sings eternal, a pale flare over marshes, where the salt hay whispers to tides changes." Now, Ezra Pound's lines reflect the paradox that we, fleeting beings and fleeting moments on a speck of dust in oceans of dark space, also embody something which persists. What light sings eternal? What persists amid the sea salt tidal changes? Let us consider how archetypal energies flow through our species and out of the rolling chaos of atoms create a world we can know and provide us something timeless amid our short and troubled transits. In his memoir, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, Carl Jung surveyed his life in an oral recollection. Many of you have read that. It is, he noted to his reader, not an account of the events of his life, that's mere biography, but an unfolding of the psycho-spiritual way stations on his long journey of discovery. Similarly, a number of my clients presently are over 65. And we've noted that many of their dreams are seemingly reviews of their lives. It may be that the psyche continues to sort and sift through the accumulated debris of our biographies and keeps inquiring, what was that about? What was the reason or meaning for that? What stood at the railway switch of life and sent the train of consequences down this line versus another? And most of all, what has this whole journey been about? Our psyche, this meaning-making, meaning-needing organ we all possess, seemingly is trying to work it all out. Give us a view that transcends our daily enmeshment in details, the detritus of moments which pass so quickly. Even when life provides us only with shards, glimmers, glimpses, don't we all want to see the bigger picture of which our life is such a small part? When we come to our end, will we be conscious? Will we wonder what our journey was about? Will we perseverate over our mistakes, the roads not taken, the woundings? Or will we remain curious, tracing what was unfolding from within all that while? While we may grieve the imminent loss of this world, might we also remember the words of Rilke to a young poet, and I quote him here. He said to this troubled young man, "Do not be frightened. If a sadness rises up before you, larger than any of you've ever seen before, if a restiveness, like light and cloud shadows, passes over your hands and over all you do, you must remember that something is happening with you, that life has not forgotten you, that it holds you in its hands. It will not let you fall. Why do you want to shut out of your life any uneasiness, any miseries, or any depressions? For after all, you do not know what work these conditions are doing inside of you." Or will we, in moments of cynicism, think of this whirl and wonder of life as simply a bizarre delusional fiction, a brief part in a larger drama than we can fathom, and perhaps conclude that we played the most trivial of roles? Were we real? Were we really here? Were we something more than a fictional character? The poet Danusha Lemras wonders about this, wonders about fictional characters. in a poem of the same title, fictional characters. Do they ever want to escape? Climb out of the white pages and enter our world? Holden Caulfield, slipping in the movie theater to catch the 2 o'clock. Anna Karenina, sitting in a diner, reading the paper as a waitress serves up a cheeseburger. Even Hector, on break from the Hilliard, takes a stroll through the park, admiring the tulips. Maybe they grew tired of the author's mind, all its twists and turns. Or were they finally weary of stumbling around Pamplona, a bottle in each fist, or eating lotuses on the banks of the Nile? For others, it was just too hot in a small California town where they'd been written into a lifetime of plowing fields. Whatever the reason, here they are, roaming the city streets, rain falling on their phantasmal shoulders. Wouldn't you, if you could, step out of your own story to lean against the doorway of the Five and Dime, sipping your coffee? Your life somewhere far behind you, all its heat and toil, nothing but a tale, resting in the hands of a stranger, and the sidewalk ahead of you, wet and glistening. So sometimes we feel we are fictive characters in some drama of which we know so little. So, however, when Jung dictated his work, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, he wrote a paragraph that I took note of recently because there was something peculiar there at his suggestion of multiple intra-psychic characters, that is to say, within us, and a large archetypal drama which the individual is carrying. We think we have generated what transpires for us, but is not the delusion of the ego consciousness that prides itself on its sovereignty, its autonomy. And is that not the attitude of the flea that astrides the crest of the lion and imagines all the other beasts are afraid of its magnificence? I often think of the human ego as a thin wafer floating on an iridescent ocean. It can so easily be engulfed by the billows around it, but it arrogates to itself a privileged position, fancies itself a sovereign in a world of lesser beings, and makes large choices having large consequences. But how often is the ego really in charge? Is the human ego ever really free of other influences? Is it often not captive to dissociative clusters of energy known as complexes? Or is it not an unwitting servant to their archaic tapes? And is it not also carried by large archetypal winds across the turning pages of eternity? Well, the ego consciousness that we prize so highly serves a concrete purpose, namely making decisions which help us navigate the perils and promises of daily life. It is also subject to forces which it cannot know. After all, the general problematic of the unconscious is that it's unconscious. So that sorting and sifting of influences, choice, consequences, and all their sequela is how the psyche itself is informing, perhaps teaching, perhaps correcting our ego's brief reign as a presumptive sovereign. But let's listen to Jung's paragraph from Memories, Dreams, and Reflections first. And he references Philemon, which was his name for the intra-psychic figure he associated with sagacity, with wisdom, who spoke to him most profoundly in his journey. Philemon and other figures of my fantasies brought home to me the crucial insight that there are things in the psyche which I do not produce, but which produce themselves and have their own life. Philemon represented a force which was not myself. In my fantasies, I held conversations with him, and he said things which I had not thought consciously. For I observed clearly that it was he who spoke, not I. He said I treated thoughts as if I generated them myself. But to his view, thoughts were like animals in the forest, or people in a room, or birds in the air. And he added, quote, "If you see people in a room, you would not think you had made those people or that you were responsible for them." It was he who brought me the idea of psychic objectivity, the reality of the psyche. Through him, the distinction was clarified between myself and the object of my thought. He confronted me in an objective manner, and I understood there is something in me which can say things that I do not know and do not intend, things which may even be directed against my ego interests. Now, let's unpack that paragraph for a moment. It's very provocative. When confronted, as so many of us have been, with an insurgency from below at midlife or at other crisis nodules in our journey, Jung decided not to down an analgesic pill or seek a guru through whom he might find an external authority to offer him clarity and direction. Instead, he chose to turn within, to pay attention to the thoughts, feelings, images which flooded him from below, and to record them, to dialogue with them, to paint them, to sculpt them. In seeking to identify and record these affective invasions, he both honored their authority and also rendered them sufficiently conscious to be open to him through an aperture into understanding why they had come. Perhaps he was forced, as we all may be, by the appearance of an unwanted depression, a disturbing dream, or a collapse of our psychological frame, to admit the autonomy of the unconscious, the otherness of that other that we carry. In naming the other, he gave it a respect while also objectifying it sufficiently to allow him to dialogue with it. Only dialogue, what he called in Swiss German the Auseinandersetzung, that means setting one thing over against each other, or it's a word for meaning a dialectic or dialogue. Through that Auseinandersetzung, the consciousness of the other that was hitherto unconscious enlarged and emerged, and he could deal with it. Accordingly, Philemon was the name he gave, or which was presented to him, for the image of ancient transpersonal wisdom that seemed to be directing this storm of affect-laden imagery that flooded him. Reportedly, he was told by Philemon and others that he had not imagined them, but they exist in some way as objectively other, in that they confront the ego in its limitations. In admitting the autonomy of the other, Jung began to realize the objective reality of all matters psychological. And by psychic, we mean those internal agencies confronting our sensibility in some autonomous and felt way. When, for example, we fall into a complex, we have our sense of self and world changed. We are momentarily possessed by somatic manifestations in our bodies. We are driven by emotions which stir us, and often we unwillingly serve reflexive enactments of the splinter programs that history generated within us. In those moments, we're in a subjective experience of the other as objective other. At its worst, this is the stuff of psychosis, where one communes with demons, daimons, and deities which overwhelm the fragile ego state. But Jung held to his conscious standpoint at the same time, never forgot his grounding in this world, as his vast scholarship, his daily practice, and his social life and travels demonstrated. Though he wrote, "Philemon spoke, not I," he experienced Philemon as that other who confronted him, but he never lost contact with the I, which grounds him in this world, in this time and this place. That other reminded him that if he saw animals in the forest or people in the room, that he had not created them, but they had come to him as other. And when that other becomes part of us, we're summoned to take in their being, their testimony. So if we grow from all of our relationships with others without forgetting that we are separate from our friends and our partners. In the Eden Project, I mentioned that the greatest gift of relationship is the otherness of the other. Rather than as a solution and anodyne for whatever troubles our life, the otherness of the other brings an enlarging world to us that we're invited to engage and to internalize. We literally grow through the engagement and taking in of the otherness of the other. But because this other is other, it's not always the friend of ego comfort or predictability. The summons of that other is often intimidating, even frightening to the ego world, such as when we are called upon to grow or to sacrifice something dear to our hearts. But presumably, this other carries the imperative and the agendas of nature or divinity, and therefore will be served one way or another. If we flee that encounter, it will spill into the world through projections or unconscious behaviors, or creep up on us through illness or compelling dreams. So whenever possessed by that other, we risk being disconnected from the reality of the present world. In a sustained disconnect, as I mentioned, that's called psychosis. But in a world which holds its position, but with an open attitude, that is able to record, dialogue with, learn from that other, the whole is enlarged and emerges less divided and less discordant. As Jung writes, and I quote again from MDR, "At times I feel as if I'm spread out over the landscape and inside of things, and I'm myself living in every tree, in the plashing of the waves, in the clouds and the animals that come and go, in the procession of the seasons. There's nothing in the tower that has not grown into its own form over the decades, nothing with which I am not linked. Here everything has its history, as well as mine. Here is space for the spaceless kingdoms of the world and the psyche's own hinterland." One of my favorite observations came from the surrealist poet Paul Eluard, who was writing around 1915, so a little over 100 years ago. He said once, "There's another world, and it is this one." And I think his aphorism, his line, is suggesting that there is always a depth dimension, even in the surface of the world we live in. And Jung was clearly one of those persons whose intuitive capacity was such that he could enter into that field of energy and experience it as another, and at the same time, as I pointed out, hold the position of consciousness. Now, we all know about complexes, and they are personal and reflect our unique biographies. But I want to mention archetypes for a while because they're transpersonal and they link us to all of humanity and therefore link us to the timeless and serve both as template and umbilical blood web into the substrata of nature itself. It would help us to think of an archetype as a verb and not a noun because we carry archetypes, if we carried archetypes as nouns, they would be visible on our MRIs or our CAT scans. They would be objects, in other words. In other words, you may know a noun, a person, place, or thing, but you rather must think of them as energies, purposive energies, patterning energies, and you begin to appreciate their dynamic character. But energies in service to what? In service, of course, to nature's purpose, not necessarily the ego's. However, it's through this innate archetypal formative process that we as individuals link to the universal, and as time-bound mortals link to the timeless. The dream you dream tonight may replicate someone's dream from ancient Babylonia, or echo some contemporary's dream from Irkutsk or Samarkand. The seeming free behavior of this hour may be driven by a formative energy known only through the myths and wisdom literature of the ancients. Now, I want to read you 3 sentences from Jung. Again, they're very simple sentences. They're all from his work. He was writing this in 1911. It was published in 1912, Symbols of Transformation. It was the book that helped break him from Freud at that time. And in Symbols of Transformation, Jung is reflecting that the unconscious is not just instinctually driven, but it has a meaning dimension. If it has a meaning dimension, therefore there's a spiritual aspect to that, because that engages one in the question of values. Now, these sentences are very simple sentences, but they're packed. And then I want to break them down a little bit. He said, and I quote, "The archetypes are the numinous structural elements of the psyche and present a certain autonomy and a specific energy which enables them to attract out of the conscious minds those contents which are best suited for themselves. These symbols act as transformers. Their function being to convert libido or psychic energy from a lower to a higher form." I'll repeat that sentence, but I am going to try to explain it. The archetypes are the numinous structural elements of the psyche and present a certain autonomy and specific energy which enables them to attract out of the conscious minds those contents which are best suited for themselves. These symbols act as transformers, their function being to convert libido or psychic energy from lower to a higher form. Now, again, those are just 3 sentences, but they're loaded. Now, let's look a bit closer. The archetype, he says, is numinous, meaning we don't choose it. It's an autonomous energy that's independent of ego consciousness, and it confronts us. To have a numinosity means it's something that touches us and something that moves us, something that in some way is engaging us. We can become aware of its impact, we can be driven by it, or we can have it operating in our lives without even an awareness of its influence. He also said archetypes are structural elements. In other words, they organize, they structure. That's why I say it's a verb. Maybe life itself is inherently meaningless. It's only atoms combining and decombining. But in some way, what characterizes human experience is that we organize the world into patterns through these instinctually generated interactions with the environment. Out of these patternings arise our sense of structure, meaning, purpose, and of course our cultures. Jung goes on to say, the patterning process attracts out of the conscious mind, quote, those contents which are best suited for themselves. So in a dream, you may merge your 3rd grade teacher with a movie character and a family member, all in service to the symbolic field where ordinary ego boundaries dissolve and daytime logic is suspended. The seemingly disparate features of our lives have hidden unities, and a dynamic relationship through that symbolic field becomes expressed. Now, what he's saying there is you and I can have a dream responding to a situation, and maybe our response will be similar, but our dream-making system, our dream-making machine, if you will call upon our central casting for certain characters or certain motifs or colors or animals or whatever form, unique to our histories or biographies. But the archetypal core is held in common. Many times I've had people say in therapy, well, I've read about all these great archetypal dreams in the Jungian literature, and I've read about them in traditional literatures and scriptures and so forth. Why don't I have archetypal dreams? Because they're assuming it has to be something on a mountaintop and heroic and so forth, when many times their dreams are filled with archetypal patterns, because it's the pattern, not the content, Content comes from our personal unconscious and is confronting and modified by consciousness, but it's the pattern that is the universal. And so we will see, for example, the process of descent or the process of journey or the process of engaging the shadow, cast in terms of a drama so unique to that person's life. It's as if they're commenting on what happened yesterday at work or in the family or whatever. And the archetypes are at work. But again, that's why Jung posited that triune level of the human psyche, with the thin wafer at the top we call consciousness. Beneath, of course, is the personal unconscious, which contains everything to some degree, which has happened to us since our birth, and can be triggered. I mean, you see this from time to time when maybe someone you haven't thought of literally in decades will suddenly reappear in your dream, or some scene from childhood that you've never paid attention to, but there it is in living color. And of course, that deeper, broader level is what we share in common with the rest of humanity. Another way of putting this is archetypes are our psychic pictures of the puzzling world into which we were thrown. Archetypes are our psychic pictures, if you will, of the puzzling world into which we were born. They give us a handle on the evanescent forms of things and enable us to stand in relationship to the large other that the world brings to us. In other words, physics tells us today that there is nothing solid. The chair upon which I'm sitting is a swirling mass of electrons. The me that's speaking to you is a congery of energy systems with no constancy other than that which is held by the psyche. That what provides constancy in our life is the human psyche. Reportedly, Goethe's motto was, or question, life question was, "Was dauert im Wechsel?" What abides amid change? And he felt that was his core question. What provides constancy in the constant transformation of nature? Or as Heraclitus put it, nature is a burning bonfire. And the bonfire is consuming itself at all times, and its shape is forever flickering in a different configuration. So our lives are. So again, what provides continuity other than the human psyche? Something that operates at a deeper level than our memory does, as occurs even if we have, a cognitive disorder later of dementia. There is still something that provides that core sense of identity and unity within us. Now, let me give you an example of the archetypal imagination at work in our species and how it autonomously emerged to address one of our deepest longings to understand the mysteries in which we swim. Each autumn, as the weather begins to turn cold, I reflect on the hardship our ancestors bore as the sun plummeted into the underworld. An annual catabasis, or voyage into the underworld, which must have been for them, if not terrifying, at best problematic for their survival. Given that we are the animal that desires to know, to develop stories that help us relate to the inexplicable, and sometimes monstrous forces around us, so their primal archetypal imagination conjured up all sorts of stories of cosmic animals that had eaten the sun, or malevolent gods that had abducted it from its office of warming our crops and our person. As one example, I want to cite a visit my wife and I made to Newgrange a number of years ago, which is about an hour northwest of Dublin in Ireland. A number of years before that, what were thought theretofore to be simply hills were revealed to be burial chambers. Aerial photography has since revealed the places dotted with these ceremonial burial chambers. And, aerial photography is helping, and even satellite imagery, as you probably have read, is helping reveal ancient civilizations. I was reading recently about a huge, huge city somewhere in Georgia that probably would have held tens of thousands of people that were unknown, but satellite imagery is revealing the streets and structures that were once there. Today, this is all rightly controlled by the Irish government to protect its fragile state, but you can go down into the recesses of one of those domes. From afar, they actually look like football stadia. They were 90 meters across, well, roughly 100 yards, and one descends about 20 meters into a cavern in which one light bulb now hangs. The guide informs us that this structure was built 5,200 years ago, which makes it older than the pyramids in Egypt and much older than Stonehenge. When she turns off that one bulb, then we know what dark it's really like. We are, for a moment, one with those whose bodies had once been placed there, wholly in the mysterious underworld. Furthermore, we see what is called at the top of by the ceiling, what is called a latchkey slot, about the size roughly, as I could estimate, of a shoebox. In the late days of December, particularly around December 21st and so on, for a matter of minutes each day, that slot is aligned with the sun, now at its furthest perigee from our northern vision. Stunningly, the room is briefly illumined by that light. There in the dark cavern, in the darkest time of the year, in the northern hemisphere, this light exfoliates. What are we to make of that elaborate construction, which is so clearly tied to the solstice? And the word solstice means literally the sun standing still. Now, standing in that profound darkness, in that sacred space, I had three thoughts which came to me literally in this progression. First, I marveled at the engineering acumen that had cantilevered those stones to create that space. There was no steel or iron there, no wonder glue. They were all cantilevered against each other. And I hoped that their architectural skill would persist for at least another few years, given that I and others were underneath those stones. Second, I was moved by the astronomical sophistication which could so accurately calculate the movement of the stars and planets, which they could have only seen and dimly by the naked eye. Thirdly, I realized suddenly and I was moved by recognizing that I was in the presence of the great mother archetype of which Jung and others spoke. Now, the great mother archetype, of course, is the archetype of nature itself. We speak of Mother Nature, from whose depths we come and to which we return. Remember, an archetype is recognized through its incarnation in a form available to consciousness, but is not created by that individual consciousness. In other words, it allows us to stand in relationship to the mystery. It is a timeless patterning process whose contents vary greatly, but whose form is universal. The Great Mother is a personification of the birth, death, and rebirth process through which all individuals and all cultures move. So there in that Irish cavern, I bore witness to the archetypal idea that even in death, even in the darkest hours, a scintilla of light was present. The germ of rebirth, renewal, and the great cycle is catalyzed into rotation back to the fullness of summer. Over time, the various festivals of light, such as Christmas and Hanukkah and many others, were attracted to that archetypal motif like iron filings to a magnet. In other words, no one knows when Jesus was born, of course, but that the Christian archetypal imagination, of course, gravitates to the idea of the solstice as a turning nodule, just as Easter plays that role for other reasons. Any person, any culture that has a sense of participation in that great cycle of death and rebirth feels a deep psychosocial spiritual connection to a transpersonal energy. And any culture such as ours, which has cut itself free from that cycle, will suffer dread with aging and mortality, will feel rootless, adrift, and live as a stranger on this earth. Many of you will remember from MDR, Jung's visit to the Taos Pueblo and his conversation with the chieftain there. And the chieftain told him about their primal story that linked them to the great rhythms of death and rebirth. And he said every morning they spit in their palms and went out to welcome the sun. And the saliva representing their soul stuff, so to speak. And he went on to explain to Jung, he said, you see, if Brother Sun does not feel welcomed, it will stop coming here. And that will bode very badly, not only for us, but for you folks as well. And then he went on to say, he said, you folks are like hungry grasshoppers. He says, you're always on the move. You come, you devour everything, and you move on to devour something else. And he said, we don't have to go anywhere because this is home. This is our home. When I was visiting there with my son, I had some occasion to talk to some of the indigenous population, and I was asking them a little bit. I couldn't ask about content or anything, but asking if they continue to have their religious services and their rites of passage and so forth. And I was assured that they did, and it was strictly off limits to visitors, of course. But to go back to Ireland for a moment, there in that dismal concavity, I felt emotionally for a moment linked through the archetypal imagination, common to all of humanity, linked to those distant predecessors, and reminded that we are all summoned to reconnect with those forces which lie outside our powers, and yet in which we daily swim. We can thank those ancestors for their imaginal labor, which now links our age with theirs, and Jung for describing the archetypal field of energy, which allows us to stand in relationship to that which is larger than we. Immortal sap runs through the world tree, and while we are very mortal, perhaps we profit to remember our connection to the larger is best obtained through the archetypal imagination, which courses through each of us. Our branch of the evolutionary tree has survived, and there are many of humanoid projects that they are now aware of. Ours survived because of its capacity to track those invisible energies, or at least to speculate upon them until better pictures emerge. While we've often fallen captive to our own constructions, thinking them the phenomenon themselves, we are led by their autonomous transformations sooner or later to more evolved pictures that nature represents or presents to us. The German word for imagination is Einbildungskraft, which if you take it apart, means the power of creating an image, Einbildungskraft. And that affect-laden image then possesses the power to educate or inform. Bildung, often is sometimes loosely translated as education, means the expectation that a person may acquire knowledge and capacity for choice at a range of cultural perspectives, and that he or she is adept in multiple disciplines, including the sciences and arts, by having more pictures. In other words, the more pictures we have, the wider the range of our choices. This is why we have education. This is why we have travel. It's why you have a Jung Society. Ordinarily built, B-I-L-D, or picture or image, intimates this capacity for forming a picture, is a human reflection of the universal mind and powers of what has sometimes been called divinity. Much more recently, in the 19th century, poet and critic Samuel Taylor Coleridge differentiated the forms of or activities of the imagination. He called it primary imagination, secondary imagination, and fancy to illustrate the divine mimesis or imitation. Fancy is what we would call today fashion or taste or aesthetics. What color that rug should be there, given the couch and coffee table over here. Secondary imagination is the echoing of the divine act through the overt powers we exhibit in creating art, music, literature, architecture, theory, models, and so forth. The primary imagination lies in our elemental constitutive powers, which Kant and many others identified as number, spatiality, sequence, and the like. In other words, Kant said we never see or experience the other directly. We experience it always intra-psychically. Immanuel Kant and Hume and others essentially ended traditional metaphysics, made phenomenology and depth psychology necessary, because it then became necessary to say, since we can't know the ding on seek, the thing in itself, we have to begin to take more seriously and study the mechanisms, the sort of transitions, the blockages, the distortions that occur intra-psychically, which then construe or misconstrue our experience of the other. Additionally, in the 19th century, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, in his Defense of Poetry, and Arthur Schopenhauer, in his book The World as Will and Representation, speculated that it is imagination, not reason, that is our highest faculty, because it's imagination that makes morality possible, opening us to empathy, sympathy, and compassion. You'll notice both of all those words contain the word pain. Pathos is the Greek word for suffering. Passio is the Latin word for suffering. So empathy, sympathy, compassion. While reason can differentiate and divide and categorize, imagination can intimate the oneness beneath the disparity of things. In other words, you and I are profoundly separate, different planets floating through time and space, but through the imagination, we can enter the field of the experience of the other and literally, at some level, suffer along with that other person. The German word for compassion is Mitleid, to be with the pain, the capacity to suffer with, and again, arises from the imaginal power and not the rational power. So too, in our time, quantum physics has presented us alternative pictures of the universe, and as our instrumentalities evolve, even those pictures will violate the received dicta of conventional reason. Neutrons apparently can occupy multiple loci in an atom at the same time, and without traversing the distance between orbits. Newtonian mechanics provided a rich, pragmatic description that lasted for centuries. But for all of its utility over the centuries, it lacked sufficient imagination to cope with the questions and instruments we have today. The poet E.E. Cummings once titled a book of his, Is 5, because he wanted to remind us there are worlds in which 2 + 2 is 5. When Einstein was asked if he believed in God, he replied in a cable to Rabbi Herbert Goldstein, Spinoza's God, suggesting that he was, like Newton, interested in reading the nature of things without necessarily positing a personality to it as well. And who, even more than Cummings, reminded us of the fictive nature of ego constructs, their relativity, than Einstein, Niels Bohr, and others who imagined a picture that might do justice to phenomena that simply refused to fit into pictures that had worked rather well for centuries. It is, of course, to the credit of science that it seems more willing to let go of its previous pictures, far more willing than most theologians when a better picture is required. Recently, I read when the Dalai Lama was asked what he would do if science successfully challenged his beliefs, he said, "I'd change my beliefs." You won't find many folks saying that. In the end, we might repeat that archetypes form our psychic pictures of the world. Pictures that make familiar its smoky terrains, its terrifying declivities, its rolling chaos. In the end, the world is as it is, with or without us. But we bring to it a formative sensibility, an order, a purpose, an evolving meaning. That informing order comes from within us and through us into the world. It is not about us, but it is from us uniquely in the end. The archetypal imagination is what we modestly bring to order history's disheveled table. Some of you may recall that in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, Jung also talks about the time he was in a safari in Africa. And he got up one morning and walked out at dawn while everyone else was still sleeping. And he just walked out onto the veldt and was watching the great streams of beasts migrating, he said. And he could hear in the distance the cry of scavenger birds and so forth. And he said, I felt as if I was the first person in the first hour of the formation of this earth. You know, I was in that Edenic state. And he said, I had this deep intuitive knowing why I'd been brought here. I, another animal, had been brought here. He said, I'd been brought here to bring awareness to brute beauty, or to brute nature, I should say, or to brute being, I think was his phrase. I was brought here to bring awareness to brute nature, to bring consciousness. Each of our lives swirls through mystery, from the first scattered shards of experience, through the troubled islands of our biographies, across savannas of suffering, to an unwelcome dispersal back into the swirling universe. And yet there is a kinship coursing beneath all things, one informing energy. We all carry it. It is implicate in all living things. Somehow invisible tendrils reach out and connect all. Some have called that energy love, at least what Dante called the love that moves the sun and the other stars at the end of his journey. It is as if we were all serving unwittingly a calling, an unfolding of energy which was meant to be embodied, even as we are, all the while the simplest of human instruments to bring it into the world. Rather than ask the question which the ego wants to ask, why am I here? And that's a good question. Society has provided us with many answers to that question. Maybe we should better ask the question, what wants to enter the world through me? Is that not better to reflect on when we consider what our incarnations might mean, not from the ego or cultural position, but from the standpoint of nature or of divinity? Is not our calling then to serve that purpose, even as it may prove costly to fitting in to ego comfort or anxiety-driven agendas? As my good friend, the poet Stephen Dunn, explained in his poem, The Prayer You Asked For, I want you to trust, for me, that belief doesn't matter to me anymore. Only love does in this grand unruly scheme of our lives together. Now, I started with a poem by Ezra Pound, Raising Questions, and I want to end with the poem by Eleanor Lerman called There Is a Woman Standing on the Terrace. And it's a very touching and moving poem, I think. And the reason that I bring it is it somehow intuits and swirls in that mystery that informs and skirts about our ordinary days in profound ways. And maybe it has a message that's related as well to Valentine's Day tomorrow. But it suggests that however obscure, however recondite, however incognito our passages, there is something working through us at all times and bringing us to the places we need to go. And even the most foreign is now seen as both friend and invitation. And this is the poem. There's a woman standing on a terrace. She's wearing a silk sheath, green, I think, as pale as tea. She's holding a drink so icy that it tastes like mercury. The Pleiades are overhead, and she's gazing eastward toward the South China Sea. How do you know? Because this is after all your work is done, after the passing of so many, the travel that took you nowhere, after you married and divorced, after your children defied you, which meant that you had done your job. Now you are so old that you are free to hope. Nothing needs to be considered except the root of your desire, which has become that crystal sliver of pain that all the doctors told you was a chronic headache, but you suspect might have been the original nerve still pulsating, the ache that has been with you always. So, eat breakfast, pack lightly, then start your journey to the deep water bay, to the hotel on a hill above Repulse Bay. What does it matter that you were never meant to be here? What does it matter that when you speak to her, she will answer in French? You will be able to understand her if you want to, and she will know who you are. Bring her a drink that tastes of melon, and as the sky hangs out its starry animals, a fish, a bear, a canny dog, tell her how long it took to form these constellations, that human beings have named them, that anything is possible, and that you are the proof. Well, I hope some of these thoughts might be provocative to you, to open some questions to you. And I'd like to turn it back over to Charles and see what sorts of comments and questions, maybe protests, come from our audience.
Thank you, James. I'm looking, and I think everyone has been absorbing what you said, and I really appreciate the different takes, first on complex, but so deeply on the archetype. And, it was expressed at some point in reading that, ideas are not something you have, but they have you. And these archetypes that you've talked about, I think, are working exactly the same way. So I guess the question that I might pose as we look for some is with the different archetypes, these different intra-psychic figures, do they ever work at cross purposes with one another? Is there a conflict there sometimes that, or do they resolve that and you just kind of get the benefit of that, whatever insight you might have about these Roiling archetypes?
Well, with respect, Charles, and this is not a criticism, it's a question that occurred to me, but this is the typical ego response of saying, I want to figure this out so that I'm reassert my autonomy here and my be in charge. Because one thing to remember, what we have to say about these things comes from our ego, which is already in some way a split off shard cluster of energy from nature itself and from our own nature. And looking at things from an archetypal perspective, all archetypes have their opposite as well. They are ambivalent, all right? So just take the image of the Great Mother. The Great Mother is, I remember once walking into a lecture one time where somebody was waxing eloquently about the Great Mother. and all of the beneficent forms of healing and so forth, and renewal of nature, all of which is true. But I kept waiting to hear the other side. The Great Mother is death, depression, desiccation, desuetude, and despair. It's what takes you out of life as well. And anytime that we try to embrace that and cut off something, we are in violation of nature itself. That's why I said there, when I was in the depths of that cavern in Newgrange, and I was reflecting on the Great Mother, and we probably were under the ground 45 minutes or an hour, something like that. So there's time to reflect on these matters. I was thinking, those cultures that understood what is associated, the imagery often associated with the Great Mother is the eternal return, the great cycle, and the cycle of sacrifice. Those are images. Those are metaphors to describe the activity of death, rebirth, death, rebirth, death, rebirth, etc., which is happening in our bodies as we speak to each other. Our cells are dying, and cells are being reborn. We're not the same person, from moment to moment, literally. And by the way, they say that the single biggest component in dirt in your household dirt, is discarded human skin. So you look under the bed and you'll see somebody's coming or going there, you see. So from the ego standpoint, it has an attitude about being part of that great cycle, because the ego naturally wishes to prize itself as exempt from that cycle. And that's the source of our neurosis, so to speak. We're the most neurotic culture in history, as far as we can tell, when it comes to aging and mortality, because our very instruments and extension of life has fed the ego's fantasy of living on in perpetuity. And its perpetuation is, on the one hand, excuse me, an understandable fantasy that it might have, but that's all it is a fantasy. And therefore, most people in contemporary culture look on aging and mortality with a kind of horror, because it's the continuing daily reminder that the ego is not the boss. It's not in charge of the universe. And it's having to face the fact that its sands slip away, of course, from the hourglass. So you can take an image of the father, take an image of the child, take an image of the mother. Which mother? Which aspect of the mother? Which aspect of the child? When we see a child in a dream, is that the positive dimension of possibility? Is that fortuity? Is that growth, spontaneity? Or is that the regressed, infantile, needy, and dependent part of the personality? You see? So, again, we always have to say that Jung's concept of the archetype, which rose out of his primarily working with psychotic patients, and he was interested in the mysteries before he became a psychiatrist even, but he was working with psychotic patients, particularly schizophrenics. He realized that the imagery that they were producing spontaneously, and I have seen this myself, had its predecessors in the great mythologies and religions and literatures of history. And in the book Tracking the Gods, I have a chapter in there called Eating the Sun, which is showing the archetypal myth-making process in two schizophrenic patients I worked with many years ago in a psychiatric hospital. Also in that same book, Tracking the Gods, there's a chapter there that talks about the two great cycles of myth, the linear myth, which is the myth of growth and development from innocence to experience, the developmental process from zygote to the mature individual, and then, of course, the great cycle. Because all of cultures were organized around one or both of those mythological axes. Now, back to your question. We're not in charge of this process whatsoever. Life is happening Think again of archetypes as how this, well, for example, when you see the geese flying south in the fall and flying north again in the spring, why do they do that? To the best of our knowledge, they don't consult their calendars and say, we better book some motels along the way, getting down there to, Galveston and so forth. Something deep within them, we call it their instinct, is moving them in a way that serves the survival of their species. Now, that's an archetypal process. Jung considered archetypes as instinctually grounded. They're in this animal. But here's the interesting mystery. Are those geese conscious in any way? Do they reflect upon that process? I don't know. I doubt it based on our current information, but on the other hand, I may be simply ignorant. But we do. We can separate from that and realize that when we are most at home in this world and most at home with ourselves is when we're in some way in accord with those archetypal processes. And we're most adrift when we are separated from it. So as we have created an artificial culture, we separate ourselves from these great rhythms all the time. Now, when we stop and think about that, the simplest definition of neurosis is where I'm separated from nature. So our culture, a perfect example is people sacrificing their lives for economics. As Hillman said, the old battle of the gods is over for our time. It's been solved by the great God economy. More people worship the great God economy around the world, but particularly in the West, than any other single value system. And that's a done deal for our time. And, in the future, according to Harari and others, the big data will be the God of the future. Who controls the data controls the world. But it's another story. So again, what we consider contradictions in nature are our contradictions, not nature's contradictions. That's the point. There's the paradox that Pascal and so many others have reflected upon. How is it that I can be here, be conscious, but my very consciousness makes me anxious because I realize I'm in peril at every moment of this existence being annihilated? So that consciousness, which we use for wondrous tools, for sure, and gifts of culture, also can separate us from nature. It's the source of our neuroses. And just very briefly, in the Genesis story, there are two trees. The tree of life from which you can eat, which is, I think, the world of instinct, and the tree of knowledge, which is the world of culture. It's not that there's anything wrong with knowledge. It's once you move from the instinctual ground to the world of culture, to the artifices of the human consciousness, that the split occurs. That's the fall. That's the separation from Eden. Then the Adam and Eve reportedly say, oh my God, we're not wearing our clothes. Well, does a cow have clothes? No, it doesn't have to have clothes. But once people are engaged in some kind of, ego construct world, then you have that split going on there. So I would say it's the ego that asks the question, because nature is nature. And nature is not particularly interested in our comfort, as you may have noticed. So where's the problem? Is it in nature? No, it's probably in the attitudes I bring to it. So we can say more about that, but I'm sure you have other questions.
Well, James, we are getting some questions in about archetypes, and let me turn one over to Julie Turner. If you'll unmute, if you'd like, and ask your question. And if not, I can read it, but go ahead, Julie.
Mr. Hollis, can you talk about archetypes that you feel that you have been most in contact with or have most influenced you or that you've most been with?
Well, if archetypes are our nature, The patterning process, remember, the patterning, this is not a content. This is the thing I have to try to remember. It's not a content, because if it were a content, it would be a noun, an object. It's formative energies. So the archetypal process flows through each of us. So we're in contact with it constantly. It's part of what brings order to our lives, not just our calendars, but the concept of time itself, of duration and termination, are archetypal, in a sense, energies. And again, as I said, they're psychic pictures of the world. Now, as one thinks about that, and I look back, and I mentioned at the beginning, so many of my clients are seeing in their dreams the reviewing of life. And I find that for myself, as now that I'm 80, I'm very much looking over this journey and asking questions about what has that been about and so forth. And I now see threads that we're running through that I couldn't have known at the time. I mean, I could name a few, but one is, the field of learning. I think as a child, and I'll try to be brief about this, I experienced a world of constriction, of worry and anxiety and poverty, and nobody to blame, just social conditions. And I remember thinking, as a child, there has to be something more than this. There has to be something that means more than this. And I can remember being extremely hungry when I went to grade school. And my teachers became my heroes. And I've spent my whole life connected to teaching, either as a student or as a teacher. And I've taught at the college level for 56 years now. And so that's a long time. And sometimes people talk about what, using classical mythology as a prop, if you will, what God have you been in service to? For me, or oppressed by, as the case may be. And in fact, Jung talked about a neurosis as an oppressed or neglected God, meaning some primal energy. For me, the prevailing God has been Hermes. And, Hermes was the god of communication. And the Hermetic function is to move between. The last book was titled Living Between Worlds. Well, we live between worlds all the time. And so my life work has been moving between the material, the mystery, and myself, and trying to sort of mediate that gap, trying to take the material and communicate it to the student, trying to do that through books and lectures and with clients and so forth. Now, that's not a career choice that you put down with the IRS and your taxes, but that's sort of it's an archetypal image that tells me that I've been serving something that was more than my conscious choice from the beginning. If you look at the next to the last two paragraphs in Jung's Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he's sort of wanting to sum up there, but he's extremely cautious and modest there. He says, I can't say anything ultimately for certain. Many of the things that I wanted and I got didn't work out for me. And many of my failures and disappointments provided the greatest growth for me and so forth. He said, I can only say this, that through my life, there has been a certain continuity of being, and that some force has carried me consistently through that. And that was the image with which I began, as my friend in the Philadelphia area had, of the whale that came up underneath her raft. She just had this profound sense, and she's had some difficult times in her life, as we all have. She just had this feeling somehow of being carried or sustained by something. And when it released her, she felt at peace with that it was carried. The title of this painting, which, oops, you can see it by my wife. I don't know why that doesn't show up very well. It's very peculiar why that doesn't do that. Why does this not work?
Your
Well,
background, maybe?
I don't know. Anyhow,
There it is.
whoops.
Oop.
It's called Hermes Has Arrived. It's painting by my wife, so which she painted quite separately from this conversation. But so I can't really answer your question, except that I can now see that there are certain energies that have carried me. And I think there's some continuity in you today
Thank you.
that was there as a baby, and for all the changes in your life, that's still there. And that's your core thread. And again, as I said, our task is not to say, why am I here, as much as what once entered the world through me? Because I think ultimately, if we're not serving being, I don't want to sound grandiose about that, but if you're not serving what your capacities are, then you're probably serving a complex somewhere. And that's probably less worthy of your life, perhaps. Another question?
Yes, we have one from John Crowley. If you would like to unmute yourself and ask the question about an archetype. John, are you still with us? I'm not hearing John. While we wait for John, let's go on to Linda Sprague, who has a question. Linda, can you unmute?
Thank you. Dr. Hollis, I was wondering a little more about the Great Mother, the cycle, of course, but the polarity of it being the death part. I also wonder if you would consider the polarity, the witch part of the feminine that casts a spell, the spell caster in, say, folk tales. Not the good witch who gives us a plant remedy, but the witch like Eris who destroys the party, interrupts the party, and creates chaos to keep us from actually engaging with the Great Mother. It's like the opposite or something. I don't know. I was just curious.
Well, no, each of those energies, our consciousness over time has come to differentiate. They're all aspects of one kind of informing process of nature, but we can break it up into these differentiated values. And that's why when you look at the archetypes, for example, the trickster, or the devil figure or whatever, the trickster embodies the fact is the reminder constantly the ego's not in charge. It's kind of like Murphy's Law across the cosmos. If something can go wrong, it will, the trickster is the thing that upsets the apple cart.
Right. Yeah.
That keeps you. I mean, it's often been built into religions. I actually attended a indigenous ceremony that my son took me to outside of Santa Fe once, which he had special access. And the trickster is often there to indicate that you can't have this service, this too formulaic or too rigid, because that's not the spirit. It drives the spirit out rather. And so the trickster is built into the process, Kogopelli, So the witch is one aspect of the encounter with the archetype of life, really. Mm-hmm. It casts spells on us and is demonic and is the antithesis of life. You can talk about, excuse me a second. Robert Johnson talks about in the depression as being in the grip of the hideous damsel. That's when the witch has you in the depression. That's not the supportive part of life. That's the part that shuts you down and leads you to self-injury and so forth. So in us is nature. And nature is all things. And part of what Jung's concept of the shadow was, we carry all of nature within us. That's why when I've talked about the shadow before in Taoist, I've said probably the wisest sentence ever uttered about human nature was from Terence, the Latin poet. nothing human is alien to me. So I don't want to see the part that is vain or jealous or petty or the aggressive, murderous part. But then why would I think that I'm exempt from the human condition? Why would I think my DNA is suddenly special? That's simply the ego trying to separate itself from that which challenges its authority. So that's why Jung would say, you know, a shadowless person is a very unconscious person, a very superficial person, because they're not in contact with the fact they carry all possibilities within them. And you know, the source of meaning is not in nature, it's here. You know, one thing we can say about this animal is we are the meaning-seeking, meaning-creating animal, and we suffer. And Jung said, the smallest of things with meaning is always greater than the largest of things without meaning. And that's the nature of our creature. And, you know, if people have meaning, they can bear any suffering, serve any cause if meaning is present. And, you know, an animal will protect its young, for example, or fight a predator. It's instinctually geared to survival. But would it die for an abstract principle? I don't know. I doubt it. So, another question, Charles?
James, we have another from Jason Williams. If you will unmute Jason and ask your question. It seems to be a short question, but a little on the profound side. So, Jason?
Sure, thank you. Would you speak briefly about the role archetypes can play in trauma?
Sure. You know, many people dealing with PTSD today, and some influenced by Jungian perspective, talk about that in addition to the neurological impact that trauma generates in our lives, deep-seated trauma is always a wound to the soul. Now, another way of talking about that is it's a wound to our deepest level of being itself. And it's a wound to the spirit, which is the energy that serves this life. So, you know, there's that very fine book, The Body Keeps the Score by Colquitt, and I recommend it to everybody. And, you know, what we see in trauma is more quanta of experience than the system can process at the time, which is why someone who's been traumatized has flashbacks and troubling dreams and other symptoms in the body and so forth, and it rolls off into the body, is the system, the nature is trying to process and metabolize that experience, which is why sometimes time and repetition and so forth allows some of the pathology of the trauma to be disseminated or released. And what you see there, in a sense, is an archetypal healing process when there's been a wound at the deepest level of a person's life and soul. Again, don't think of archetype as something mystical. It's again, as far as I understand it, as Jung defined it back in 1912, is a formative process that helps us make sense of life. And part of what happens in trauma is often our sense of life has been violated. There have been strange studies through the years, contrary to our bloodthirsty nature as a species, which is evident in history, that was first done by the British historian S.L.A. Marshall. It realized in World War I, and then repeated in World War II, is that the average soldiers, and I forget the exact percentage, it's been so many years, but it was like 20% of soldiers, even under fire, harsh combat conditions, never shot back at the enemy, even though they thought they had. And they found many rifles with the bullets still in the rifle. And yet people were willing to swear quite conscientiously that they were engaged in shooting at the enemy. And the conclusion of Marshall and others since was repeated in other studies that there was a kind of archetypal prohibition against killing something that is also one's kin. There's the power of the human imagination. What you kill out there is also part of you. Which is why in the traditional cultures, I talk so much about that. I talk about that in the Tracking the Gods again. In traditional cultures, before the hunt, there was always a ritual purification and a religious service, because you're going out there to kill brother bison or sister otter or whatever, who are voluntarily laying down their life for us. You have to do it with pure heart and intention and with gratitude, and to thank them for their gift, knowing also you too are part of that process of the great cycle that leads back to the Great Mother. Now, that's a world that we don't live in anymore, but it's a world that made sense psychologically. And I think in some way would allow one to absorb trauma in a greater way. Another way of talking about trauma is it's an experience that the framing devices of our present pictures is insufficient to contain. So part of what we have to do is, of course, broaden our sense of the range of our pictures that really literally allows us to process far more trauma, just as we do when we travel. You know, you learn the customs of another country and you broaden yourself and your capacity for adaptation. So it's a subject of infinite interest. We're basically out of time. Maybe we can have one more question, because I know people do have schedules.
I don't see another person who's able to talk. John Crowley was wondering if we fall into the grip of an archetype to the point of being possessed, and that sounds a little bit more like a complex to me.
Well, no, but he's right. No, he's right.
Okay.
Jung said underneath every complex is some archetypal energy. And to be caught in an archetype happens, for example, the shadow. One Jung wrote about in his essay on Wotan, the Nordic storm god. He said the archetype of the hero and the archetype of the shadow crossed with Hitler. That the one who comes to rescue and redeem the people, and yet at the same time carries its darkest energies. There's an incredible sentence that Jung said in his essay After the Catastrophe that reads roughly like this, which was his looking at Germany after the war. In a disordered time, the German people chose the most disordered among them to be their leader, and they followed him like a Pied Piper across the rooftops of Germany until they fell into the streets below and broke their backs. Now, they had been gripped by an archetype, including the archetype of war. When Hitler talks, not Hitler, sorry, I beg your pardon. When Hillman talks about a terrible love of war in his book on war, he says, we're not going to get rid of war because it's an archetypal process. It's always been, it always will. You know, we can't afford to have war with the lethal tools we have, but the archetype of war will always be with us. Mars is a god, or Ares is Greek form, and he's not going away. So, complicated stuff. You know, we're out of time. I want to say thank you again for inviting me to join you, and a great affection for this society. And I hope that next February, perhaps, if invited, we'll have a chance to be with you folks in person in